Sometimes the cruelest moments in life become the greatest blessings in disguise. When the whole world laughs at you, that's when you discover what you're truly made of. At a dusty auction, a rich rancher forced a broke cowboy named Jake to take the most dangerous horse in the territoria, massive black stallion called Thunder that had killed 2 men. "This giant horse is your trip to the funeral, poor man," the wealthy man sneered, thinking he'd just sentenced Jake to death. But Jake saw something different in Thunder's wild eyes. What started as public humiliation became the most powerful partnership the Old West had ever witnessed. Would Jake survive long enough to prove that heart matters more than money? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook, a frontier town where a man's worth was measured by the size of his spread and the weight of his purse. Jake Thornton walked slowly down the wooden sidewalk, his worn boots making soft sounds against the weathered planks. In his calloused hands, he carried his father's old saddle-cracked leather, held together by careful stitching and stubborn hope. The saddle was all he had left of the family ranch, lost 3 years ago to debt and drought. Jake paused outside Hartwell's general store, studying his reflection in the dusty window. At 32, he looked older than his years. Sun and hardship had carved lines around his grey eyes, and his brown hair was already showing silver at the temples. His clothes were clean but patched, his hat shaped by countless seasons under the desert sky. He'd been working odd jobs around town breaking horses for other men, mending fences, hauling supplies, anything to keep food in his belly and a roof over his head. The bell above the store's door chimed as Sarah Hartwell emerged, carrying a heavy crate. Without thinking, Jake stepped forward to help, lifting the burden from her arms. Sarah was a widow in her late 20s, with kind blue eyes and auburn hair that caught the morning light. She'd inherited the store from her late husband and ran it with quiet efficiency, treating everyone fairly, regardless of their station in life. "Thank you, Jake," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You don't have to help every time you see me struggling." "My mama raised me better than to watch a lady carry heavy things," Jake replied, setting the crate on the loading dock. He touched the brim of his hat. "Besides, it's no trouble." Sarah studied his face with concern. "Have you eaten today? You look thin." Jake's stomach chose that moment to growl, answering her question. He felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'll be fine, Miss Sarah. Got some work lined up." She disappeared into the store and returned with a cloth bundle. "Leftover biscuits and ham from breakfast. Take them, I can't let them go to waste." Jake accepted the food with gratitude, knowing she'd probably made extra just for him. In a town where charity often came with judgment, Sarah's kindness never carried conditions or shame. Across the street, the imposing figure of Bartholomew Wellington emerged from the cattleman's bank. Wellington owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, along with half the businesses in town. At 55, he was a man accustomed to getting his way through money, influence, or intimidation. His expensive clothes and polished boots marked him as different from the working men around him. His cold blue eyes surveyed the street like a king, viewing his domain. Wellington's gaze settled on Jake, and his mouth curved into a smile that held no warmth. There was history between them, a debt that Wellington had bought from the bank, a debt that had cost Jake everything he'd ever owned. The rich man crossed the street with deliberate steps, his silver-headed cane tapping against the wooden boards. "Well, if it isn't young Thornton," Wellington said, his voice carrying the authority of money. "Still living day to day, I see, still dreaming of better times." Jake straightened, meeting the older man's stare. "Mr. Wellington, I trust you haven't forgotten our arrangement. The debt doesn't disappear just because you've lost everything else." The arrangement. Jake remembered it clearly. Wellington had bought his debt from the bank and offered terms. Jake could work it off at Wellington's ranch for pennies on the dollar, essentially becoming an indentured servant. Or he could face the consequences when the debt came due. "I haven't forgotten," Jake said quietly. Wellington's smile widened. "Good, because tomorrow is market day. And I have a feeling something special might come up for sale, something that might settle our accounts permanently." Before Jake could ask what he meant, Wellington tipped his hat to Sarah and walked away, leaving Jake with an uneasy feeling in his chest. Doc Harrison's veterinary clinic sat at the end of Main Street, a modest building that served both animals and, when necessary, the people of Millbrook. The doc was in his 60s, with gentle hands and a reputation for being able to heal anything with 4 legs. He'd been Jake's father's friend and had watched Jake grow up on the family ranch. Jake found the doc examining a limping mare in the small corral behind the clinic. The older man looked up as Jake approached, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Jake, my boy, how are you holding up?" "Well enough, Doc. Need any help today?" Doc Harrison gestured toward the mare. "This old girl needs her shoes reset, and I've got 3 more horses coming in this afternoon. Could use an extra pair of hands if you're available." Jake set down his father's saddle and rolled up his sleeves. Working with horses had always been his gift, could read their moods, understand their fears, calm their nerves. It was a talent his father had recognized early, back when the Thornton Ranch had been known for producing the finest saddle horses in the territory. As they worked together, Doc Harrison shared the town's gossip. The drought was finally breaking, cattle prices were rising, and several ranchers were expanding their herds. There was opportunity in the air for those who could seize it. "I heard Wellington bought your debt from the bank," Doc said quietly as he cleaned the mare's hoof. "Yes, sir, he did. That man's got ice water in his veins, never does anything unless there's profit in it for him." Jake nodded, focusing on the horseshoe he was shaping. The rhythmic hammering of metal on metal provided a comforting counterpoint to their conversation. "Your daddy would be proud of how you've handled yourself," Doc continued. "Lost everything but kept your dignity. That's worth something in this world." As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself thinking about his father's words. "A man's character isn't measured by what he owns, son. It's measured by how he treats what's been given to his care." His father had been talking about horses at the time, but Jake understood the deeper meaning. The sun was setting when Jake finally shouldered his father's saddle and prepared to head back to his small room above the barbershop. Doc Harrison pressed a few coins into his hand, more than the work was worth. But Jake had learned to accept kindness when it was offered. "Jake," Doc called as he reached the gate, "be careful around Wellington. That man's planning something, and I've got a feeling you're part of it." Walking back through town in the fading light, Jake noticed the handbills posted on fence posts and building walls. Tomorrow's livestock auction promised to be the biggest of the season. Horses, cattle, and farm equipment would be sold to the highest bidder. It was always an event that brought the entire community together, a chance for ranchers to expand their herds, for farmers to upgrade their equipment, and for townspeople to socialize and conduct business. In his small room above the barbershop, Jake sat on his narrow bed and ran his hands over his father's saddle. The leather was soft with age and use, marked with scratches and scars from years of hard work. His father had carried this saddle through good times and bad, through cattle drives and roundups, through the building of a dream that had ultimately been lost to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Jake had no way of knowing that tomorrow would change everything. He couldn't foresee that Bartholomew Wellington's cruelty would become the catalyst for the most important relationship of his life. He simply prepared for sleep, hoping that tomorrow's auction might bring some small opportunity to earn enough money to buy another day of independence. Outside his window, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of change. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the darkening sky, though there were no clouds visible in the star-filled heavens above Millbrook. The wooden auction platform stood like a stage at the center of Millbrook's dusty main square, weathered planks bearing the scuff marks of countless boots and hooves. By 9 in the morning, half the county had gathered around the makeshift arena, ranchers and townspeople alike, drawn by the promise of good livestock and better gossip. The autumn air carried the mixed scents of horse sweat, leather, and the coffee brewing at Sarah's booth near the general store. Jake stood at the back of the crowd, his father's saddle resting against a hitching post beside him. He'd counted his coins, 3 times barely enough for a decent bridle, certainly not enough for a horse. But auctions were free entertainment, and he enjoyed watching the interplay between buyers and sellers, the subtle negotiations that happened with raised eyebrows and slight nods. Auctioneer Pete McAllister climbed onto the platform, his voice already warming up with practiced enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Millbrook's finest livestock auction. We've got horses, cattle and equipment that'll make your neighbors green with envy." The first hour brought the usual parade of saddle horses, work mules, and breeding cattle. Jake watched Wellington bid aggressively on a string of quarter horses, his silver-headed cane tapping against the ground each time he raised the price. The rich man seemed to be buying for the sake of buying, driving prices higher than necessary just to demonstrate his wealth. Then the atmosphere changed. A commotion arose from behind the livestock pens as 6 men struggled to lead something toward the auction block. Even before the crowd could see what was coming, they could hear it, the thunderous sound of hooves striking wood, the angry snorts and squeals of an animal pushed beyond its limits. "Gentlemen," McAllister called out, his voice carrying a note of warning, "we come now to lot number 47. This here's a stallion that's been the talk of 3 counties. Goes by the name Thunder, and he's earned every letter of that title." The horse that emerged from behind the pens took Jake's breath away. Thunder stood nearly 17 hands high, his coal-black coat rippling with muscle and barely contained fury. His neck arched like a bow drawn taut, and his eyes, Jake had never seen eyes like those in a horse. They burned with intelligence and rage, with a wildness that spoke of pain and betrayal rather than natural spirit. Thunder's lead rope was actually a thick chain, held by 2 men on each side, while 2 more controlled a rope looped around his hindquarters. The stallion's nostrils flared wide as he scanned the crowd, his ears pinned flat against his skull. When he reared, pawing the air with iron-hard hooves, several people in the front row stepped back instinctively. "Now, I'll be honest with you folks," McAllister continued, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "This horse has got a reputation. He's already sent 2 men to their graves and put 3 more in Doc Harrison's care. But look at the size of him, the bloodlines in those legs and that chest. This is a king among horses if someone can figure out how to ride him." Jake found himself moving closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. Up close, Thunder was even more magnificent and terrifying. Scars marked his hide where ropes and whips had left their marks, and his breathing came in short, angry snorts. But there was something else, something Jake recognized from his years of working with difficult horses. Beneath the rage, he saw fear. Beneath the violence, he saw a creature that had been pushed too far, hurt too deeply. "Bidding starts at $50, McAllister announced. The crowd fell silent. $50 was a month's wages for most working men, and that was just the starting price for a horse that might kill you before you could get him home. "Come on, folks, look at the size of this animal. He's got to be worth something to somebody." More silence. Thunder's eyes swept the crowd, and for a moment they locked with Jake's. In that instant, Jake felt something pass between thema recognition, perhaps, or a challenge. The horse's ears flicked forward for just a second before pinning back again. $40, McAllister tried. Wellington stepped forward, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden platform. "Pete, I think you're overvaluing this particular animal. He's not a horse, he's a menace. Someone's going to get killed just trying to transport him." The rich man's voice carried across the square, and Jake noticed how people nodded in agreement. Wellington had a way of speaking that made his opinions sound like facts. "Now, Bart," McAllister said nervously, "this is still a fine animal with good bloodlines." $20, someone called from the crowd, "and that's being generous." "15, countered another voice. Jake watched Thunder's reaction to the declining bids. The horse seemed to understand that he was being diminished, reduced to a problem no one wanted to solve. His muscles quivered with tension, and foam flecked his mouth where he fought against the bit. $10, Wellington called out suddenly, "and I'll put him out of his misery before he kills someone else." A murmur ran through the crowd. Everyone knew what Wellington meant. The horse would be shot rather than rehabilitated. "I've got $10, McAllister said reluctantly, Do I hear 15? Silence stretched across the square. Jake felt his heart pounding as he watched Thunder's magnificent head toss in frustration. This wasn't just an auction anymore, it was an execution being carried out in public, with the pretense of commerce to make it palatable. Going once at $10. Jake's hands clenched into fists. He thought of his father's words about treating what had been given to your care. He thought of the pain he'd seen in Thunder's eyes, the fear beneath the fury. Going twice. Without conscious thought, Jake stepped forward. $25. The crowd turned to stare at him, and Wellington's cold blue eyes fixed on Jake's face with sudden interest. A smile played at the corners of the rich man's mouth, not pleasant, but calculating. "Well, well," Wellington said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Young Thornton thinks he can succeed where better men have failed. How much money do you actually have, boy?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks as dozens of pairs of eyes examined him, taking in his patched clothes and worn boots. He pulled the small handful of coins from his pocket, not enough to cover his bid, not even close. "I've got $8 and some change," he said quietly. Wellington's laugh rang across the square, joined by nervous chuckles from the crowd. $8? You bid 25 and you've got 8? The rich man's voice grew colder. "That's either fraud or foolishness, and I'm not sure which is worse." "Mr. Wellington," Jake began, but the older man cut him off with a raised hand. "However, we do have that small matter of your debt to discuss. What do you owe me, Thornton? Remind the good people of Millbrook." Jake's throat felt dry as dust. $147. $147, Wellington repeated, savoring each word. "For feed and supplies advanced to your father before he lost the ranch. Now, I'm a reasonable man, and I believe in giving people opportunities to settle their accounts." Wellington walked closer to Jake, his silver-headed cane tapping rhythmically against the ground. The crowd pressed forward, sensing drama unfolding. "Here's my offer, Thornton. You take this horse, this Killerand. If you can make him useful, we'll call your debt settled. If you can't." Wellington shrugged eloquently. "Well, let's just say the sheriff has cells for men who can't honor their obligations." Jake looked at Thunder, then back at Wellington. The choice was no choice at Aldepta's prison, or take his chances with a horse that had already killed 2 men. "And just to make things interesting," Wellington continued, his voice carrying cruel amusement, "when this giant horse carries you to your funeral, poor man, I'll make sure everyone remembers how you died trying to prove you were better than your circumstances." The crowd held its breath. Thunder seemed to sense the tension, his muscles coiling like springs ready to explode. Jake walked slowly toward the magnificent, dangerous animal, ignoring the whispered warnings from the people around him. Up close, Thunder was even more impressive. His black coat gleamed, despite the scars, and his legs were perfectly proportioned pillars of bone and muscle. When Jake reached out his hand, the horse jerked his head away, eyes rolling white with suspicion. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his voice barely audible above the crowd's murmur. "I know you've got reasons to be angry. I know someone hurt you bad." For just a moment, Thunder's ears flicked forward again. Then he snapped at Jake's outstretched hand, missing by inches. "I'll take him," Jake said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. Wellington's smile was triumphant. "Excellent. Pete, mark that down. Thunder goes to Jake Thornton for the sum of $147, paid in forgiveness of debt." The crowd began to disperse, most people shaking their heads in a mixture of pity and disbelief. Jake had just signed his own death warrant, and everyone knew it. Only a few people lingered: Sarah Hartwell, whose blue eyes showed concern rather than pity, and Doc Harrison, who was already mentally preparing his medical supplies. As the men began to prepare Thunder for transport, the horse's gaze found Jake again. This time, Jake didn't look away. Whatever had passed between them in that first moment was still there, waiting to be understood. Thunder was coming home with him, and Jake had no idea whether he'd live to see another sunrise. The makeshift corral behind Doc Harrison's veterinary clinic looked pitifully inadequate as Jake surveyed the collection of weathered fence posts and rusty wire he'd managed to scrounge together. Thunder stood in the center of the small enclosure, his massive frame making the space seem even smaller than it was. The horse hadn't moved from that spot in 3 hours, hadn't touched the water Jake had provided, hadn't acknowledged human presence except to pin his ears and bare his teeth whenever someone came too close. Jake sat on a wooden crate outside the fence, studying Thunder's every movement, every flick of ear or tail. The crowd from the auction had long since dispersed, but a steady stream of curious townspeople found excuses to walk past Doc Harrison's place. Some came openly to gawk, others pretended to have business with the veterinarian, but all wanted to see the fool who'd taken on a killer horse. "He hasn't moved a muscle," Doc Harrison observed, settling onto another crate beside Jake. The older man's weathered hands held 2 cups of coffee, still steaming in the cool afternoon air. "Just stands there like a statue made of fury." Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, warming his hands around the tin cup. He's thinking, look at his eyes, they're not wild anymore. He's studying everything, figuring out his situation. Thunder's dark eyes did indeed seem to be cataloguing every detail of his new surroundings. His gaze moved methodically from the fence posts to the gate, from the water trough to the pile of hay Jake had placed in one corner. When his attention settled on Jake, there was no madness in his stare, only a calculating intelligence that was somehow more unsettling than rage would have been. "Most horses would be pacing by now," Doc continued, testing the fence, looking for weak spots. "This one's just waiting." A commotion from the street drew their attention as Bartholomew Wellington's carriage pulled up in front of the clinic. The rich man stepped down, brushing dust from his expensive coat, and approached the corral with the measured steps of someone inspecting his property. "How's your investment working out, Thornton?" Wellington's voice carried its usual note of condescension. "Still breathing, I see. That's more than most people expected." Jake didn't respond, but Thunder's reaction was immediate and violent. The stallion's head shot up, his nostrils flaring as he caught Wellington's scent. A sound rumbled from deep in his chestnut, quite a whicker, not quite a growl, but something that made the hair on Jake's arms stand up. My, Wellington chuckled, stepping closer to the fence. "Seems he remembers me. Good horse, Thunder. Remember who owns you now." The stallion moved, for the first time since being penned, crossing the small corral in 3 powerful strides to press against the fence nearest Wellington. But instead of the aggressive posturing Jake expected, Thunder's ears came forward, and he extended his muzzle toward the rich man. Wellington reached toward the horse's nose, and Thunder's teeth snapped like a bear trap, missing the man's fingers by a whisker. Wellington jerked his hand back, his face flushing red with anger and embarrassment. "Vicious beast," he snarled. "You'll be lucky if he doesn't kill you in your sleep, Thornton." After Wellington's carriage disappeared down the street, Jake noticed Thunder's demeanor change again. The horse returned to the center of the corral, but his stance was different, now more alert, more agitated. He began to pace in a small circle, his hooves churning the dirt into dust clouds. "He knows that man," Doc Harrison said quietly, "knows him and hates him." Jake nodded, filing away this observation. In his years of working with horses, he'd learned that animals were excellent judges of character. They could sense cruelty, fear, and deception in ways that humans often missed. As evening approached, Jake began the delicate process of attempting to care for Thunder's basic needs. The horse had still not touched the water or hay, and dehydration could kill him faster than any kick or bite. Jake approached the fence slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Easy, boy. I know you don't trust me yet, and you've got every right to feel that way, but you need water, and I need you to stay alive long enough for us to figure this out." Thunder's ears swiveled toward the sound of Jake's voice, though his body remained rigid with tension. When Jake unlatched the gate and stepped into the corral, the horse wheeled to face him, nostrils flared and muscles bunched for attack. Jake froze, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. He'd learned this technique from his father when dealing with a frightened or angry horse. You had to convince them you weren't a predator. He crouched down, avoiding direct eye contact, and began speaking in a quiet, steady voice. "I'm not here to hurt you, Thunder. I know somebody did, and I know you remember every bit of it, but I'm not that person." For several minutes, they remained locked in this strange standoff. Jake crouched motionless near the gate, Thunder poised to strike at the first sign of threat. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the stallion's stance began to relax. His ears came forward by degrees, and his breathing slowed from angry snorts to more normal respirations. Jake began to move, still crouched low, toward the water trough. Thunder's muscles tensed again, but he didn't attack. When Jake reached the trough, he noticed it was positioned too close to the fancier horse, as large as Thunder would feel trapped, trying to drink there. Moving slowly, Jake dragged the heavy wooden trough toward the center of the corral, giving Thunder room to approach it from any direction. The horse watched this process with obvious interest, his head tilting slightly as if puzzled by this consideration for his comfort. "There," Jake said softly, backing away from the repositioned trough. "Now you don't have to worry about someone cornering you while you drink." Thunder approached the water cautiously, never taking his eyes off Jake. When he finally lowered his head to drink, the sound of him taking long, desperate gulps made it clear he'd been thirsty for hours. Jake felt a small surge of satisfaction. He'd correctly read the horse's needs and found a way to meet them without force or confrontation. As darkness fell over Millbrook, Jake settled onto his crate for what he expected to be a long night of watching. Thunder had moved to the far side of the corral after drinking, but he remained standing, alert to every sound and movement. Doc Harrison emerged from the clinic, carrying a lantern and a thick blanket. "You planning to sleep out here?" "Don't have much choice. He's not ready to be left alone yet, and I need to learn his patterns." The older man studied Jake's determined face in the lantern light. "Your father would have done the same thing. He had a gift with difficult horses, too." "This is different, Doc. Thunder's not just difficult, been broken in the worst way. Someone took all that power and intelligence and used it against him. Now I've got to convince him that not all humans are his enemies." Doc Harrison placed the blanket around Jake's shoulders and set the lantern on a post where it would provide enough light to see the horse. "I'll check on you both in a few hours. If he charges the fence, you get out of there, you hear me?" As the night deepened and the town grew quiet, Jake found himself settling into a rhythm of observation. Thunder would stand motionless for long periods, then suddenly lift his head to test the wind or examine some small sound. The horse's senses were incredibly acute. He seemed aware of everything happening within a quarter-mile radius. Around midnight, Jake was startled from a light doze by a soft sound from the corral. Thunder had moved to the pile of hay and was pulling out small mouthfuls, chewing thoughtfully while keeping one eye on his human observer. The simple act of the horse feeding himself felt like a victory. "That's right," Jake murmured. "You're going to need your strength for whatever comes next." Thunder's ears flicked toward the sound of Jake's voice, but he continued eating. For the first time since the auction, the stallion looked almost peaceful, as if he might be considering the possibility that this new situation wasn't necessarily a death sentence. Jake pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and settled in for the rest of the night watch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of patience and understanding. But tonight, for the first time, both man and horse had taken the small steps necessary to keep each other alive. Dawn broke gray and cool over Millbrook, painting the desert landscape in soft pastels that would soon give way to harsh sunlight. Jake stirred from his makeshift bed on the wooden crate, his back stiff from sleeping upright against the fence post. Thunder stood exactly where he'd been when Jake had dozed off, alert, watchful, but no longer radiating the same furious tension that had marked their first encounter. Jake reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out 3 small sugar cubes he'd borrowed from Sarah's store the previous evening. In his experience with difficult horses, sometimes the smallest gestures could build the foundation for trust. He held 1 cube on his flat palm and approached the fence slowly. "Morning, Thunder." Thought you might like something sweet to start the day. The stallion's nostrils flared as he caught the scent of sugar, and his ears came forward with obvious interest. But when Jake extended his hand through the fence rails, Thunder backed away, snorting his suspicion. Jake didn't push. Instead, he placed the sugar cube on top of a fence post and stepped back several paces. Thunder watched this entire process with the focused attention of a predator studying prey, though Jake hoped the analogy would soon prove inaccurate. For nearly an hour, man and horse engaged in a delicate dance of approach and retreat. Thunder would move toward the fence post, examine the sugar cube from various angles, then retreat when Jake shifted his weight or cleared his throat. Finally, with movements as quick as a striking snake, Thunder snatched the cube and crunched it between his powerful teeth. The change in the horse's expression was subtle but unmistakable. His ears remained forward, and he actually took a step closer to where Jake stood outside the fence. Not close enough to touch, but closer than he'd been since arriving at the corral. "Good boy," Jake said softly, offering a second cube on his palm through the fence rails. This time, Thunder's approach was more deliberate. He stretched his neck toward Jake's hand, nostrils quivering as he tested both the scent of the sugar and the scent of the human offering it. When his soft lips brushed Jake's palm to retrieve the cube, the contact sent an electric thrill through Jake's entire body. It was the first voluntary touch between them, the first acknowledgement that Jake might be something other than a threat. Doc Harrison appeared at the clinic's back door, coffee cup in hand, just in time to witness Thunder delicately taking the third sugar cube from Jake's palm. The older man's weathered face broke into a surprised smile. "Well, I'll be damned," he called softly. "Looks like you might actually know what you're doing." Word of Jake's progress spread through town with the speed that only small communities can manage. By mid-morning, a steady stream of curious visitors had found reasons to pass by Doc Harrison's clinic. Some came openly to watch the spectacle, others pretended to have business with the veterinarian, but all wanted to see if the crazy cowboy was still alive. Sarah Hartwell arrived around 10 o'clock, carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and bacon. Her blue eyes showed concern as she took in Jake's rumpled appearance and the stubble covering his jaw. "You look terrible," she said without preamble. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Jake accepted the basket gratefully, suddenly aware of how hungry he was. As he unwrapped the food, he found himself telling Sarah about Thunder's small breakthrough with the sugar cubes, about the intelligence he saw in the horse's eyes, about the careful way Thunder moved that suggested grace rather than clumsiness. "He's not crazy," Jake explained between bites of Sarah's excellent cooking. "He's been hurt, and he's protecting himself the only way he knows how. But underneath all that anger, there's something special." Sarah watched Thunder through the fence rails, noting how the horse observed their conversation with obvious interest. "He's beautiful," she admitted. "Frightening, but beautiful. Those eyes of his are almost human." As if he'd heard her comment, Thunder approached the fence nearest to where Sarah stood. His movements were cautious but not aggressive, and when Sarah slowly extended her hand, he sniffed her fingers without baring his teeth. "He likes you," Jake observed with surprise. "Maybe he recognizes kindness when he sees it," Sarah replied, looking directly at Jake rather than the horse. The afternoon brought less welcome visitors. Bartholomew Wellington arrived with 2 of his ranch hands, ostensibly to check on his investment. The rich man's presence had an immediate effect on Thunder, who retreated to the far side of the corral and began pacing in agitated circles. "Still alive, I see," Wellington commented, his tone suggesting disappointment rather than relief. "How long do you think you can keep this up, Thornton? The horse is clearly still dangerous." To prove his point, Wellington gestured for one of his men to approach the fence. The ranch hand, a grizzled cowboy named Pete, had dealt with difficult horses before and approached with confidence. Thunder's reaction was immediate, and Violence charged the fence with enough force to make the posts shake, teeth bared, and hooves striking. "See," Wellington said with satisfaction, "a killer, plain and simple. You're wasting your time and risking your life." But Jake had noticed something Wellington missed. Thunder's aggression was directed specifically at the ranch hand, who carried the scent of Wellington's ranch on his clothes and skin. When Doc Harrison approached the same section of fence moments later, Thunder merely watched with alert interest. After Wellington and his men departed, Jake spent the rest of the day working on routine tasks around the corral, while Thunder observed. He repaired a section of fence, mucked out the corner where Thunder had relieved himself, and refreshed the water in the trough. Through it all, he maintained a steady stream of quiet conversation, telling Thunder about his childhood on the family ranch, about the horses he'd known and loved, about his father's gentle methods of training. "My daddy always said you can't break a horse's spirit without breaking the horse," Jake explained as he hammered a loose board back into place. He believed in partnership, not domination, said the best horses were the ones who chose to work with you. Thunder's ears were consistently forward now when Jake spoke, and the stallion had begun following Jake's movements around the perimeter of the corral. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to indicate interest, rather than mere wariness. As evening approached, Jake made a decision that went against every piece of conventional wisdom about handling dangerous horses. He opened the gate to the corral and stepped inside, moving slowly to the center of the enclosure where he sat cross-legged in the dirt. Thunder immediately retreated to the far corner, but his posture was more alert than aggressive. For the first time, Jake could see the horse's full magnificent form without the barrier of fence posts between them. Thunder truly was a king among horses, 17 hands of perfect proportion, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "I'm not going to try to touch you," Jake said quietly. "I'm just going to sit here and let you get used to having me in your space. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, you can come closer." They remained that way as the sun set and the first stars appeared in the desert sky. Thunder gradually relaxed enough to lower his head and graze on the scattered hay, though he never stopped monitoring Jake's position. The simple act of sharing space without conflict felt like another small victory. Doc Harrison checked on them around 9 o'clock, shaking his head in amazement when he found Jake still sitting peacefully in the corral, while Thunder stood less than 10 feet away. "I've been working with animals for 40 years, the veterinarian said softly, "and I've never seen anything quite like this. That horse should have killed you by now." "He's not a killer, Doc. He's just been convinced that humans are his enemies. Now I've got to prove to him that at least one human can be trusted." As the night deepened and the desert grew quiet, Jake noticed Thunder moving closer by degrees. The horse would take a few steps toward the center of the corral, pause to assess Jake's reaction, then take a few more steps. By midnight, Thunder was close enough that Jake could have reached out and touched his front legs. Instead, Jake remained perfectly still, allowing Thunder to control the pace of their interaction. The stallion lowered his magnificent head until his nostrils were only inches from Jake's shoulder, breathing deeply to memorize this human's scent. The warm puff of air against Jake's neck made him want to shiver, but he forced himself to remain motionless. For several long minutes, they held this position, horse and man frozen in a moment of mutual evaluation. Then Thunder did something that made Jake's heart race with hope. The stallion gently touched his soft muzzle to Jake's shoulder, the briefest contact before pulling back to gauge the human's reaction. "Thank you," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible in the still night air. Thunder's ears flicked at the sound, but instead of retreating, he took another step closer. This time, when he lowered his head, he rested his muzzle against Jake's shoulder and left it there, a gesture of tentative trust that spoke volumes about the horse's capacity for forgiveness. Jake closed his eyes and felt something he hadn't experienced since losing his family's ranch hope. Not just hope for survival, but hope for partnership, for the kind of bond between horse and rider that his father had taught him to value above all else. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the fragile understanding they were building. But tonight, under the vast canopy of desert stars, a broken horse and a broken man had found something worth fighting for in each other. 3 weeks after the auction, Jake stood in his small room above the barber shop, working by lamplight, to create something he'd never seen before, a bridle designed for trust rather than control. Instead of the harsh metal bits and chain shanks that most cowboys used on difficult horses, Jake was crafting a simple rope halter using techniques his father had learned from a Navajo horse trainer decades earlier. The Indian bridle, as his father had called it, was nothing more than a carefully knotted rope that applied gentle pressure to specific points on a horse's head. It relied on communication rather than force, requiring the horse to choose cooperation instead of being compelled into submission. Jake's fingers worked the soft cotton rope with practiced skill, forming the intricate knots that would distribute pressure evenly if Thunder chose to resist. The rope itself was special. He'd traded his father's silver watch to a traveling merchant for this particular length of cotton, woven so tightly it felt almost like silk between his fingers. As he worked, Jake reflected on the remarkable progress he and Thunder had made. The stallion now allowed Jake to enter the corral freely, even seeking out his company during the long desert evenings. Thunder would follow Jake around the enclosure like an enormous, dangerous dog, occasionally touching his muzzle to Jake's shoulder or back in what seemed to be gestures of affection. But they hadn't progressed beyond these tentative interactions. Thunder still wouldn't allow Jake to touch his head or neck, and any attempt to approach with equipment, even something as simple as a lead rope sent, the horse retreating to the far corner of the corral. The completed bridle lay across Jake's small table, deceptively simple in appearance, but representing weeks of careful planning and preparation. Tomorrow, he would attempt the next crucial step in their partnership. Dawn found Jake sitting cross-legged in the center of the corral, the rope bridle hidden behind his back, while Thunder grazed peacefully nearby. The morning routine had become familiar. Jake would enter the enclosure and simply exist in Thunder's space, allowing the horse to approach at his own pace and comfort level. Thunder lifted his head from the scattered hay and walked directly to Jake, lowering his massive head until their faces were only inches apart. The horse's dark eyes held an intelligence and gentleness that still took Jake's breath away. This close, he could see the small scars around Thunder's muzzle, where harsh bits had cut and chafed, evidence of the brutal training methods someone had used on him. "Good morning, big fellow," Jake said softly, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine affection. "Ready to try something new today?" Thunder's ears came forward at the sound of Jake's voice, and he gently butted his head against Jake's chest in what had become their morning greeting. The gesture never failed to fill Jake with wonder. This horse that had killed 2 men was now showing him affection that most gentle saddle horses reserved for their favorite handlers. Moving slowly, Jake brought the rope bridle around where Thunder could see it. The horse's reaction was immediate. His head shot up, and he backed away several steps, nostrils flaring as he examined this new object with obvious suspicion. "Easy, boy," Jake soothed, holding the bridle loosely in his hands so Thunder could see it posed no immediate threat. "This isn't like what they used on you before. This is just a conversation between friends." For the next hour, Jake simply held the bridle while he and Thunder went through their usual routine. The horse gradually relaxed, though he continued to eye the rope with wariness. When Thunder approached for his customary morning treat, Jake now carried sugar cubes in his pocket as a matter of course. He sniffed the bridle thoroughly before accepting the offering. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Thunder was standing beside Jake, enjoying having his neck scratched, when Jake slowly lifted the bridle toward the horse's head. Instead of bolting, Thunder froze, every muscle tense but holding his position. His eyes showed white around the edges, and his breathing became shallow and rapid. "I know you're scared," Jake whispered, his hand never pausing in its gentle, scratching motion. "Someone hurt you with something like this, didn't they? But this is different. This is just between you and me." With infinite patience, Jake allowed Thunder to examine every inch of the bridle with his sensitive muzzle. The horse sniffed each knot, tested the rope's texture against his lips, even took one of the loose ends briefly in his mouth, as if evaluating its taste. When Jake finally slipped the bridle over Thunder's ears, the horse stood statue still, trembling with the effort of controlling his fear. Jake could feel the stallion's internal struggle, every instinct screaming at him to fight or flee, while his growing trust in Jake held him in place. "There," Jake said softly, adjusting the rope so it lay comfortably against Thunder's head. "See? No pain, no force. Just a way for us to talk to each other." Thunder took a tentative step forward, then another, testing how the bridle affected his movement. When he realized it caused no discomfort, his entire demeanor changed. The fear left his eyes, replaced by what Jake could only describe as curiosity. Over the following days, Thunder wearing the rope bridle became as natural as breathing. Jake would slip it on each morning, and they would spend hours together with Jake holding the lead rope loosely, while Thunder explored every corner of the corral. The horse learned that pressure on the rope was a request, not a command, and that he could choose to respond or not without punishment. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Thunder's natural grace began to assert itself as his fear diminished. His movements became fluid and powerful, rather than tense and defensive. When he trotted around the corral with Jake walking beside him, the stallion's gait was so smooth it seemed like he was floating above the ground. Doc Harrison spent hours watching these training sessions, amazement growing on his weathered face with each passing day. "I've never seen anything like it," he told Jake one evening as they watched Thunder respond perfectly to subtle signals from the rope bridle. "You're not training him, you're having a conversation with him." Sarah Hartwell had become a regular visitor to the corral, bringing meals for Jake and treats for Thunder. The horse had developed an obvious fondness for her, allowing her to scratch his neck and even resting his head on her shoulder while she spoke to him in the same gentle tones she used with nervous customers at her store. "He's beautiful when he's happy," she observed one afternoon, watching Thunder prance around the enclosure with obvious joy in his movement. "You can hardly believe he's the same horse from the auction." But not everyone was pleased with Jake's progress. Bartholomew Wellington's visits had become more frequent and more pointed. The rich man clearly expected Thunder to have killed Jake by now, and the stallion's obvious gentleness was disrupting whatever plans Wellington had been nurturing. "This is all very touching," Wellington commented during one afternoon visit, his voice dripping with disdain. "But a gentle horse is still just a horse. When are you going to prove he's actually useful? When are you going to ride him?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jake had been asking himself the same thing for days. Thunder trusted him enough to wear the bridle, to follow his lead, to share space peacefully. But the ultimate test of their partnership would be whether the stallion would accept Jake on his back, the position of ultimate vulnerability for any horse. "When he's ready," Jake replied calmly, "and when I'm sure it won't undo everything we've built together." Wellington's smile was cold and calculating. "Time is money, Thornton, and you're living on borrowed time as it is." After Wellington departed, Jake found himself standing in the corral with Thunder, one hand resting on the horse's powerful neck, contemplating the next phase of their journey together. The stallion's trust was a precious gift, not to be squandered through impatience or pride. But Jake also knew that their story couldn't remain static forever. Thunder was a riding horse, bred and built for partnership with a human rider. Until they achieved that ultimate connection, neither horse nor man would be truly complete. The old medicine bag hung from Doc Harrison's belt like a talisman from another era, its weathered leather darkened by decades of desert sun and honest work. Inside the small pouch, wrapped in soft cloth, were herbs and remedies that had been passed down through generations of healers, both Native American and frontier veterinarians, who had learned to blend ancient wisdom with practical necessity. Jake watched with fascination as Doc Harrison carefully examined Thunder's hide, his experienced fingers tracing patterns of old scars that told the story of the stallion's brutal past. Under the bright morning sun, marks that had been invisible in the corral's shadows became clearly visible thin lines where whips had cut, rope burns around the legs where Thunder had been cruelly hobbled, and worst of all, deep scars around his muzzle where metal bits had been yanked with savage force. "Sweet, merciful heaven," Doc muttered, his weathered face showing the kind of anger that came from a lifetime of treating animals abused by thoughtless humans. What kind of monster did this to such a magnificent creature? Thunder stood perfectly still during the examination, his trust in both men now complete enough that he didn't flinch, even when Doc's fingers traced the most sensitive scars. The horse seemed to understand that these gentle touches were different from the cruel hands that had marked him, and he actually leaned into Doc's ministrations when they brought relief rather than pain. "Can you do anything for him?" Jake asked, his voice tight with emotion as he saw the full extent of Thunder's suffering. Doc Harrison opened his medicine bag and withdrew a small bundle of herbs wrapped in soft deerskin. "This is devil's claw root and willow bark, mixed with some other things the Apaches taught me years ago. It won't erase the scars, but it'll take away the deep ache that old injuries leave behind." The older man's hands worked with practiced skill, grinding the herbs into a fine powder and mixing them with warm water to create a paste. The scent that rose from the mixture was clean and sharp, like desert sage after rain. "Hold his head steady, Jake. This might sting at first, but it'll help in the long run." Thunder's reaction to the herbal medicine was immediate and remarkable. As Doc applied the paste to the worst of the scars, the stallion's entire body seemed to relax, muscles that had been held tense for years finally releasing their grip. His eyes, which always carried a hint of old pain even in their happiest moments, grew soft and peaceful. "Look at that," Doc whispered in amazement. "He knows we're trying to help him." The healing process became part of their daily routine. Each morning, Jake would lead Thunder to a sunny spot behind the clinic where Doc would apply the herbal medicine to the horse's scars. Thunder began to anticipate these sessions, nickering softly when he saw Doc approaching with the medicine bag. But it was during one of these healing sessions that Jake's anger finally boiled over. As Doc worked on a particularly cruel scar that crossed Thunder's withers, the kind of mark that could only come from repeated beatings, Jake found himself consumed with rage at the unknown people who had tortured this gentle giant. "I want to know who did this to him," Jake said through gritted teeth. "I want to find them and make them pay for every scar, every moment of pain they caused." Doc Harrison looked up from his work, studying Jake's face with the same careful attention he gave to injured animals. "Anger's a poison, son. It'll eat you alive if you let it. Better to focus on healing than on revenge." Thunder seemed to sense Jake's emotional turmoil. The stallion turned his massive head and gently nuzzled Jake's shoulder, as if offering comfort to the human who had shown him such kindness. The gesture was so unexpectedly tender that it broke through Jake's anger like sunrise through storm clouds. "You're right, boy," Jake murmured, stroking Thunder's neck. "What's done is done. What matters now is what comes next." Their first attempts at riding came not through Jake's initiative, but through Thunder's own curiosity. During one of their afternoon walks around the corral, the stallion suddenly stopped and lowered himself into a position that seemed to invite Jake to mount. It was such an unexpected gesture that Jake almost missed the significance. "He's asking you to get on," Doc observed from outside the fence. "I've never seen a horse actually request a rider before." Jake approached Thunder's side cautiously, one hand resting on the horse's withers. Thunder remained perfectly still, his breathing calm and even. When Jake finally swung his leg over the stallion's broad back, he half expected to be launched into the sky by explosive bucking. Instead, Thunder simply stood there, patient and steady, as if carrying a rider was the most natural thing in the world. Jake sat motionless for several minutes, hardly daring to breathe, while Thunder occasionally turned his head to check on his passenger with what looked remarkably like concern. Their first ride lasted less than 5 minutes, just a slow walk around the perimeter of the corral, but it represented a triumph that went far beyond the simple act of horse and rider moving together. Thunder had chosen to carry Jake, had invited the partnership that would define both their futures. Word of Jake's success spread through Millbrook with the speed of desert wildfire. People who had written off both horse and rider as doomed now spoke of miracles and impossible transformations. Sarah Hartwell's eyes shone with pride when she heard the news, and even the normally skeptical townspeople began to look at Jake with newfound respect. But success brought its own challenges. Bartholomew Wellington's visits became more frequent and more pointed, his questions about Thunder's practical value taking on an edge that made Jake uncomfortable. The rich man seemed less interested in Jake's welfare than in some private calculation that Jake couldn't fathom. "A horse that can be ridden is worth considerably more than a pet," Wellington observed during one afternoon visit, watching Thunder respond instantly to Jake's subtle signals. "I trust you haven't forgotten that your debt to me was considerable. A valuable horse might, to adjust the terms of our agreement." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. Wellington's words carried implications that went far beyond simple business transactions. The rich man was calculating Thunder's worth not as Jake's partner, but as his own potential property. "The horse stays with me," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying a firmness that surprised even him. Wellington's smile was cold as winter. "We'll see about that, Thornton. We'll see what the law has to say about debtors who try to hold on to valuable assets." After Wellington departed, Jake found himself holding Thunder close, his arms wrapped around the stallion's powerful neck, while the horse stood patient and protective. The bond they had built was precious beyond price, but Jake was beginning to understand that others might see it differently. "Don't worry, boy," he whispered into Thunder's mane. "I won't let anyone take you away from me. Whatever it costs, whatever I have to do, we're staying together." Thunder's response was to rest his head on Jake's shoulder, a gesture of complete trust that made Jake's throat tight with emotion. In the growing darkness of the desert evening, man and horse stood together against whatever storms might be coming their way. The old medicine bag hanging from Doc Harrison's belt seemed to catch the last rays of sunlight, its weathered leather glowing like a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. Inside that simple pouch lay not just herbs and remedies, but the wisdom of generations who understood that healing came not from domination, but from patience, respect, and love. The faded photograph trembled in Jake's hands as he stared at the impossible image before him. The picture showed a magnificent black stallion standing in the winner's circle at what appeared to be a prestigious horse show, a blue ribbon draped across his neck and a silver trophy gleaming beside him. But what made Jake's blood run cold was that the horse in the photograph was unmistakably Thunder's same distinctive white star on his forehead, same powerful build, same intelligent eyes that now watched Jake with curious concern from across the corral. The photograph had arrived with a traveling horse trader named Samuel Morrison, a weathered man in his 50s who dealt in fine bloodstock across 3 territories. Morrison had been examining Thunder through the fence when his face went pale with recognition. "Sweet Jesus," Morrison had whispered, pulling the photograph from his saddlebags with shaking hands. "I know this horse. His name isn't Thunder, it's Midnight Storm, and he's worth more money than this entire town sees in a year." Doc Harrison leaned over Jake's shoulder to examine the photograph more closely. The image showed not just the horse, but also a distinguished gentleman in expensive clothes holding the lead rope. The man's face was partially obscured by shadow, but his posture spoke of wealth and breeding. "Where did you get this?" Jake asked Morrison, his voice barely steady. "Been carrying it for 2 years," Morrison replied, his eyes never leaving Thunder's magnificent form. "That horse was stolen from the Whitmore Ranch outside Denver. Biggest horse theft in Colorado history. They took 12 prime animals. But Midnight Storm was the crown jewel of the operation." The pieces of a terrible puzzle began falling into place in Jake's mind. Thunder's scars, his fear of certain people, his obvious breeding and intelligent seat, all made sense if he had been stolen from a life of luxury and forced into a nightmare of abuse and cruelty. The Whitmores offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to his recovery. Morrison continued, "Dead or alive, that horse won the Colorado Territory Championship 3 years running before he disappeared." Jake felt the world shifting beneath his feet. $1,000 was more money than he'd seen in his entire life, enough to buy a ranch and start over. But it also meant that his thunder belonged to someone else. Someone who had legitimate claim to the horse that had become the center of Jake's existence. "I have to send a telegram to Denver," Morrison said, though his tone suggested he took no pleasure in the prospect. "The Whitmores have a right to know. Their horse is alive." "Wait," Jake said, his mind racing. "How do you know this is the same horse? Black stallions aren't exactly rare." Morrison pointed to a distinctive scar visible in the photographer crescent-shaped mark on Thunder's left shoulder. "See that mark? That's not from abuse, that's a birthmark. Midnight Storm was famous for it, called it his lucky charm." Jake's heart sank as he looked across the corral and saw the exact same crescent-shaped mark on Thunder's shoulder, now partially hidden by the scars of his ordeal. As word of Morrison's discovery spread through town, the implications began to multiply like ripples in a still pond. If Thunder was indeed the stolen Midnight Storm, then someone in the area had been involved in the theft. Someone had taken a champion show horse and transformed him into the broken, violent animal that had been sold at auction. Bartholomew Wellington arrived at Doc Harrison's clinic within an hour of Morrison's telegram being sent, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of barely contained agitation. His cold blue eyes fixed on the photograph with an intensity that made Jake's skin crawl. "Interesting development," Wellington said, his voice carefully neutral. "If this horse is really worth as much as Morrison claims, it changes the nature of our agreement, doesn't it, Thornton?" "How so?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Well, if you've been harboring stolen property even unknowingly, that makes you an accessory after the fact. The law takes a dim view of such things." Wellington's smile was razor-sharp. "Of course, as the man who technically owns the horse through our debt arrangement, I might be persuaded to handle this matter discreetly." The threat was clear. Wellington wanted Thunder, and he was prepared to use the law to get him. Jake felt trapped between impossible choice: lose Thunder to his original owners, or lose him to Wellington's machinations. That evening, as Jake sat in the corral with Thunder's head resting peacefully in his lap, he tried to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions and implications swirling around them. The horse seemed to sense his distress, occasionally lifting his head to nuzzle Jake's face with gentle concern. "Did you know?" Jake asked softly, stroking Thunder's neck. "Did you remember what you used to be before all this happened?" Thunder's response was to press closer to Jake, as if seeking comfort from the human who had shown him the first kindness he'd experienced in years. Champion or not, stolen property or not, this magnificent creature had chosen Jake as his partner, and that bond transcended legal documents or monetary value. The arrival of the Whitmores 3 days later brought the crisis to a head. Charles Whitmore was a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, accompanied by his son Robert and 2 professional horse handlers. They traveled in an expensive carriage and carried themselves with the quiet authority of people accustomed to getting their way through wealth and influence. Thunder's reaction to the Whitmores was immediate and telling. The moment Charles Whitmore approached the corral, the stallion's entire demeanor changed. His ears pinned back, his muscles tensed, and he retreated to the far corner of the enclosure, every line of his body radiating fear and distrust. "Midnight Storm," Whitmore called, his voice carrying the tone of someone addressing a valuable possession. "Come here, boy. Don't you remember me?" Thunder's response was to press himself against the back fence, as far from Whitmore as the enclosure would allow. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and Jake could see the old terror returning to his eyes. "He doesn't seem to remember you," Jake observed, his voice carefully neutral despite the turmoil in his chest. "Animals forget," Robert Whitmore said dismissively. 2 years of rough treatment would make any horse skittish, but bloodlines don't lie, and neither do scars. That's our horse, and we're taking him home." Jake felt his world crumbling as he watched Thunder's distress. The horse that had learned to trust, to find joy in partnership, was reverting to the frightened, defensive creature he'd been at the auction. Whatever Thunder's legal status, it was clear that returning him to the Whitmores would undo all the healing they'd achieved together. Perhaps, Doc Harrison suggested diplomatically, we should let the horse make his own choice. Animals know who they can trust. Charles Whitmore's laugh was cold and dismissive. A horse is property, not a person. It doesn't get to choose its owner any more than a saddle or a bridle does. But as the legal and ethical implications of Thunder's identity continued to unfold, Jake realized that the photograph had revealed more than just a horse's true name. It had exposed a web of deception and cruelty that reached far deeper than a simple theft. Someone had stolen Midnight Storm and transformed him into Thunder through systematic abuse. Someone had profited from that transformation by selling him at auction. And Jake was beginning to suspect that someone's involvement in the crime went much closer to home than anyone wanted to admit. The faded photograph that had seemed like an ending was actually a beginning, the first piece of evidence in a puzzle that would ultimately reveal the true villain in Thunder's story. The sheriff's badge caught the morning sunlight as Sheriff Coleman examined the pile of evidence spread across Doc Harrison's kitchen table. Samuel Morrison's photograph, telegram correspondence with the Denver authorities, and Charles Whitmore's ownership papers created a legal maze that would require careful navigation. But it was the additional evidence that Morrison had quietly gathered over the past week that truly complicated matters. "I've been asking questions around the territory," Morrison explained, his weathered face grim with the weight of what he'd discovered. Midnight Storm wasn't the only horse stolen from the Whitmore ranch. There was a whole network of thieves operating between Colorado and New Mexico, and they had inside help. Sheriff Coleman, a fair man in his 50s who'd kept the peace in Millbrook for over a decade, studied the documents with careful attention. His steel-gray eyes missed nothing as he traced the timeline Morrison had constructed. "According to this," the sheriff said slowly, "the horses were stolen in small groups over several months, then moved south through a series of way stations. Someone was changing their appearance, altering their temperaments, making them unrecognizable before selling them at local auctions." Jake felt his heart sink as the implications became clear. "You're saying Thunder Midnight Storm was deliberately broken down to hide his identity?" "More than that," Morrison replied. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They took a champion show horse worth thousands and turned him into a killer that no one would want. It was the perfect disguise." The kitchen fell silent as everyone absorbed this revelation. Thunder's suffering hadn't been random cruelty, had been a calculated business decision, a systematic destruction of his spirit designed to protect the thieves who had stolen him. Doc Harrison's weathered hands clenched into fists. To break a horse like that deliberately, to cause that much pain just to hide a crime that takes a special kind of evil. Through the kitchen window, they could see Thunder grazing peacefully in his corral, unaware that his fate was being decided by legal documents and jurisdictional complications. Jake's chest tightened as he watched the magnificent stallion, knowing that their time together might be measured in hours rather than days. "There's going to be a hearing," Sheriff Coleman announced, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "Federal court has jurisdiction because this crosses territorial lines. Judge Patterson will hear all the evidence and make a determination about the horse's ownership." Charles Whitmore, who had been listening from the parlor, entered the kitchen with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Surely this is a simple matter, Sheriff. We have documentation proving ownership, and the physical evidence is overwhelming. My horse was stolen, and I want him returned." "It's not quite that simple, Mr. Whitmore," Sheriff Coleman replied diplomatically. "There are questions about how the horse came to be in his current condition, and about who might have been responsible for the theft and subsequent abuse." Whitmore's expression darkened. "Are you suggesting I'm somehow responsible for my own horse being stolen?" "I'm not suggesting anything," the sheriff said firmly, "but the court will want to hear all the facts before making a decision." Jake found himself caught between hope and despair as the legal machinery ground into motion. On one hand, the hearing would provide an opportunity to present evidence of the bond he'd formed with Thunder. On the other hand, legal ownership was legal ownership, and sentiment rarely trumped property rights in territorial courts. It was Sarah Hartwell who provided the key insight that would reshape their strategy. She had been quietly examining Morrison's timeline when she noticed a discrepancy that everyone else had missed. "Look at these dates," she said, pointing to the telegram correspondence. The Whitmores reported midnight storm stolen on March 15th, but the last horse in the theft ring was sold at auction on March 22nd. That's more than a week after the theft was reported. Morrison leaned forward with interest. "What are you getting at? If the thieves were moving horses that quickly, why was Midnight Storm held for an extra week, and why was he the only horse that required such extensive conditioning before being sold?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Jake felt pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind, forming patterns that were almost too terrible to contemplate. Bartholomew Wellington chose that moment to make his entrance, arriving with his usual theatrical timing and accompanied by his lawyer, a thin, nervous man named Blackwood, who carried himself like someone perpetually apologizing for his existence. "Gentlemen, ladies," Wellington said with his customary false joviality, "I understand we're having a hearing about ownership of the horse in question. As the holder of Mr. Thornton's debt, I have a financial interest in these proceedings." Sheriff Coleman's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of financial interest, Mr. Wellington?" "Well, if the horse proves to be valuable stolen property, then Mr. Thornton has been unknowingly harboring criminal assets. That would void our debt agreement and make the horse subject to seizure as compensation for my losses." The legal maneuvering was making Jake's head spin, but he could see the trap Wellington was constructing. No matter how the hearing went, the rich man intended to end up with Thunder. Doc Harrison had been studying Wellington's face during this exchange, and Jake saw recognition dawn in the old veterinarian's eyes. "Bart," Doc said quietly, "you seem to know an awful lot about the legal implications of horse theft, almost like you've thought this through before." Wellington's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "A successful businessman considers all possibilities, Doctor. It's how one prospers in uncertain times." That evening, as Jake sat in the corral with Thunder, he tried to process the web of deception and greed that seemed to be closing around them. The stallion rested his massive head in Jake's lap, completely trusting and unaware of the legal battles being fought over his future. "I won't let them take you back to that life," Jake whispered, his fingers working through Thunder's mane. "Whatever it costs, whatever I have to do, I won't let anyone hurt you again." Thunder's response was to nuzzle closer, his warm breath against Jake's chest, a reminder of the bond they'd forged through patience and mutual respect. The horse had no understanding of ownership papers or legal proceedings. She only knew that Jake was the first human in years to treat him with kindness. Sarah found them there as the stars began to appear in the desert sky. She carried a lantern and a basket of food, but her blue eyes were troubled with the weight of what she'd learned during the day's investigations. "Morrison found something else," she said quietly, settling beside Jake in the dirt. "He's been tracing the movement of stolen horses through the territory, and there's a pattern. Every theft, every sale, every broken horse that's appeared at auction over the past 3 years, they all have one thing in common." Jake looked up from Thunder's peaceful face. "What's that?" "They all passed through ranches or businesses owned by Bartholomew Wellington." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. The man who had orchestrated his public humiliation, who had forced him to take Thunder, who now claimed legal interest in the horse's ownership, Wellington was the mastermind behind the entire theft ring. "He's been using his legitimate businesses as cover," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "Buying stolen horses at low prices, breaking them down to hide their identities, then selling them at auction for whatever he could get. It was never about the money from individual sales, it was about volume and the perfect cover of respectability." Thunder must have sensed the tension in Jake's body, because the stallion lifted his head and whickered softly, as if offering comfort. The gesture reminded Jake of what was truly at stake, not just legal ownership or financial compensation, but the life and welfare of a magnificent creature who had already suffered far too much. "The hearing is set for tomorrow afternoon," Sarah said, reaching out to stroke Thunder's neck. Morrison and Sheriff Coleman think they have enough evidence to prove Wellington's involvement, but proving it in court will be difficult. Wellington has money, influence, and the best lawyer in the territory. Jake stood and began pacing the small corral, his mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. Thunder followed his movements with alert eyes, reading Jake's mood with the sensitivity that had developed between them. "There has to be something we can do," Jake said, frustration evident in his voice. "Some way to protect Thunder from being sent back to people who don't understand what he's been through." "There might be," Sarah said carefully, "but it would require Thunder to demonstrate his current condition and temperament. The court would need to see the difference between what he was at the auction and what he's become under your care." Jake stopped pacing and looked directly at Sarah. "You mean ride him? In front of the judge and all those people? It's the only way to prove that Thunder chooses to be with you, that your partnership is real, not just legal ownership changing hands." The prospect terrified Jake. Not because he feared Thunder would hurt him, their bond was strong enough that he trusted the horse completely, but performing in front of a crowd, with everything they'd built together hanging in the balance, carried risks that went far beyond physical safety. What if he gets scared by all the people? What if he reverts to his old behavior? Thunder seemed to understand the conversation because he walked directly to Jake and rested his forehead against his human's chest. The gesture was so trusting, so full of faith, that it answered Jake's question without words. "He trusts you," Sarah said softly. "The question is whether you trust him." As the night deepened and the desert grew quiet, Jake made his decision. Tomorrow's hearing would determine not just legal ownership, but whether justice could triumph over wealth and influence. Whether a broken horse and a broken man could prove that some bonds transcended property rights and legal documents. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, its lonely cry echoing across the vast landscape. But in the small corral behind Doc Harrison's clinic, a man and a horse prepared for the most important performance of their lives, not for entertainment or profit, but for the right to remain together in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. The sheriff's badge would soon weigh heavily in the scales of justice, but Jake knew that the true measure of their case wouldn't be found in legal precedents or ownership papers. It would be found in the trust between a man who had lost everything and a horse who had been given a second chance at life. The courtroom gavel rested like a weapon on Judge Patterson's bench as the afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Millbrook's municipal building. The makeshift courtroom normally used for town meetings and social gatherings had been transformed into a theater of justice where Thunder's fate would be decided by law rather than sentiment. Jake sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling. Beside him, Sarah's presence provided an anchor of support, while Doc Harrison and Samuel Morrison flanked them like protective guardians. Across the aisle, Charles Whitmore and his son Robert sat with the rigid posture of men accustomed to getting their way, their expensive clothes marking them as different from the working people of Millbrook. Judge Patterson was a stern man in his 60s, known throughout the territory for his fairness, but also for his strict adherence to legal precedent. His steel-grey eyes surveyed the packed courtroom with the measured gaze of someone who had seen every kind of legal drama the frontier could produce. "This court is now in session," Judge Patterson announced, his gavel striking the bench with authority. "We are here to determine the rightful ownership of a black stallion currently in the possession of Mr. Jake Thornton, but claimed by Mr. Charles Whitmore of Denver, Colorado." Whitmore's lawyer, a polished gentleman named Crawford who had traveled from Denver specifically for this hearing, rose to present his case. His opening statement was crisp and businesslike, laying out the evidence for Midnight Storm's identity with the precision of a man who had never lost a property dispute. "Your Honor, the facts are straightforward. My client's prize stallion, Midnight Storm, was stolen from the Whitmore Ranch 2 years ago as part of an organized theft ring. Through the diligent efforts of horse trader Samuel Morrison, the animal has been positively identified and located. Mr. Whitmore simply wants his property returned." Crawford presented the photograph, the breeding records, and testimony from the ranch hands who had cared for Midnight Storm before his disappearance. The evidence was overwhelming and professionally organized, painting a picture of clear legal ownership that would be difficult to dispute. Sheriff Coleman took the witness stand to present the evidence of the theft ring, his testimony revealing the scope of the criminal enterprise that had operated across the territory. As he spoke, Jake noticed Bartholomew Wellington shifting uncomfortably in his seat, the rich man's usual composure showing hairline cracks. The pattern of thefts suggests an organized operation with local connections. Sheriff Coleman testified. Horses were stolen in Colorado, moved through New Mexico, and sold at auctions throughout the territory after their appearances had been altered. Judge Patterson leaned forward with interest. Altered how, Sheriff? The horses were systematically abused to change their temperaments and make them unrecognizable, Your Honor. Midnight Storm, now called Thunder, was transformed from a champion show horse into a dangerous animal that no one would associate with his former identity. A murmur ran through the courtroom as people absorbed the implications of deliberate cruelty designed to hide criminal activity. Jake felt his anger rising again at the thought of Thunder's systematic torture, but Sarah's gentle touch on his arm reminded him to stay focused on the legal proceedings. When Jake was called to testify, his legs felt unsteady as he approached the witness stand. He had never spoken in court before, and the weight of so many stares made his mouth dry. But when he began to tell Thunder's story, the auction, the first tentative moments of trust, the patient process of healing his voice grew stronger with conviction. Thunder isn't just a horse to me, Your Honor, Jake concluded. He's a partner. We chose each other, and we've built something together that goes beyond ownership papers. He's not the same animal that was stolen from the Whitmores. He's something new, something that came from healing and trust rather than force and fear. Crawford's cross-examination was sharp and focused, designed to establish that Jake's emotional attachment to the horse didn't supersede legal ownership rights. Mr. Thornton, regardless of your feelings for this animal, do you deny that he is the same horse that was stolen from my client? Jake looked across the courtroom to where Thunder waited in the temporary pen outside, visible through the tall windows. The stallion stood alert and patient, occasionally turning his head toward the building as if listening for Jake's voice. I don't deny his identity, Jake said quietly, but I know who he is now, and I know who chose to save his life when everyone else had written him off as worthless. The testimony continued through the afternoon, with witnesses painting conflicting pictures of the same horse. To the Whitmores, he was valuable stolen property that should be returned to his rightful owners. To Jake and his supporters, he was a living being whose welfare should take precedence over legal technicalities. Wellington took the stand as a character witness for Jake, his testimony carefully crafted to sound supportive while actually undermining Jake's case. Young Thornton has always been impulsive, Wellington said with false sympathy. He sees this horse as a chance to reclaim some of the status he lost when his family ranch failed. I understand his attachment, but sentiment can't override legal reality. Doc Harrison's testimony provided crucial context about Thunder's physical and emotional condition when Jake first took responsibility for him. The veterinarian's weathered face was grim as he described the extent of the horse's injuries and psychological trauma. In 40 years of practice, I've never seen an animal so systematically broken, Doc said, his voice carrying the weight of professional authority. Whoever did this to Thunder knew exactly how to destroy a horse's spirit while keeping him physically viable for sale. As the afternoon wore on, Jake realized that the legal arguments, while important, were missing the essential point. This wasn't really about ownership documents or property. It was about whether Thunder would be returned to people who saw him as an investment, or allowed to remain with someone who understood his true nature. Judge Patterson called for a brief recess, during which the packed courtroom buzzed with speculation about his eventual ruling. Jake used the break to step outside and check on Thunder, who whickered softly at his approach and pressed his muzzle against Jake's hand in their familiar greeting. "How are you holding up, boy?" Jake murmured, stroking the stallion's neck. I know this is confusing, all these people talking about you like you're not even here. Thunder's dark eyes held their usual intelligence, but Jake could see the stress of the unusual day beginning to affect him. The horse's ears swiveled constantly, monitoring the crowd of people and the unfamiliar sounds coming from the courtroom. When court reconvened, Judge Patterson's expression was unreadable as he prepared to announce his decision. The courtroom fell silent, every person present understanding that they were about to witness a moment that would determine not just legal ownership, but the future of a remarkable partnership between man and horse. The child's dropped doll lay forgotten in the dust as chaos erupted in the street outside the courthouse. Little Emma Fletcher had been watching the proceedings from her mother's arms when the cornflower blue rag doll slipped from her tiny fingers and tumbled to the ground. No one noticed the small tragedy in the midst of the larger drama unfolding, no one except Thunder. Judge Patterson had just begun to announce his preliminary thoughts when a freight wagon loaded with lumber came careening down Main Street, its driver fighting to control a team of spooked horses. The wagon's brake had failed on the steep hill leading into town, and 20 tons of timber were bearing down on the crowd gathered outside the courthouse with deadly momentum. People scattered in all directions, screaming warnings and grabbing for their children. In the confusion, 3-year-old Emma Fletcher broke free from her mother's protective embrace and toddled directly into the path of the runaway wagon. Her attention focused entirely on retrieving her beloved doll from the dusty street. Jake saw the disaster unfolding from inside the temporary pen where he'd been demonstrating Thunder's gentle nature to the judge. Time seemed to slow as he watched the massive wagon bearing down on the helpless child, knowing that no human could reach her in time to prevent tragedy. But Thunder had also seen what was happening. The stallion's entire body went rigid with alertness, his nostrils flaring as he assessed the danger with the lightning-quick intelligence that had made him a champion. Without hesitation, without regard for his own safety, Thunder exploded into motion. The pen's gate had been left unlatched during Jake's demonstration, and Thunder hit it with enough force to send the wooden barrier flying. His massive hooves threw up clouds of dust as he charged toward the street, every muscle in his powerful body focused on a single objective, protecting the innocent child who stood frozen in terror. Jake shouted Thunder's name and ran after him, but the stallion was already committed to his course of action. Thunder reached Emma Fletcher a split second before the wagon would have crushed her, using his body to shield her from the thundering hooves of the freight team. His shoulder struck the lead horse with enough force to turn the entire wagon, sending it careening harmlessly into the side of the general store instead of through the crowd of people. The impact knocked Thunder to his knees, but his priority remained the child's safety. Even as he struggled to regain his footing, the stallion positioned himself between Emma and any potential danger, his body creating a protective barrier around the little girl who sat in the dust, clutching her recovered doll. The crowd stood in stunned silence as they absorbed what they had just witnessed. This horse, the same animal that had been described as a killer, a menace too dangerous to be around people, had just risked his own life to save a child who meant nothing to him. Jake reached Thunder's side and dropped to his knees beside the winded stallion, his hands checking for injuries, while his heart hammered with fear and pride. Thunder's left shoulder bore a deep scrape from his collision with the freight horse, and he was breathing heavily from the impact, but his eyes remained focused on Emma Fletcher with protective concern. "Easy, boy," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did good. You did so good." Emma's mother reached them moments later, tears streaming down her face as she scooped up her daughter and turned to face Thunder with an expression of pure gratitude. The little girl, seemingly unaware of how close she'd come to disaster, reached out from her mother's arms to pat Thunder's soft muzzle. "Thank you," Mrs. Fletcher whispered to the horse, her voice barely audible above the crowd's murmur. "Thank you for saving my baby." Thunder's response was to gently nuzzle the child's hand, his ears forward and his expression as gentle as a lamb's. The contrast between this moment and the violent, dangerous animal from the auction could not have been more stark. Judge Patterson had emerged from the courthouse in time to witness the rescue, and his stern expression had given way to something that might have been wonder. He approached the group gathered around Thunder, his legal robes incongruous in the dusty street. "In 30 years on the bench," the judge said quietly, "I've never seen anything quite like that. This horse, this supposedly dangerous killer just, saved a child's life at considerable risk to his own safety." Bartholomew Wellington pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger and something that looked remarkably like panic. "Your Honor, this doesn't change the fundamental legal issues at stake. Property is property, regardless of theatrical gestures." But Wellington's words fell on deaf ears. The crowd that had gathered to watch a legal proceeding had just witnessed something that transcended law and property rights. They had seen courage, selflessness, and instinctive nobility in action. Charles Whitmore and his son had also witnessed Thunder's heroic act, and Jake could see conflict playing out on their faces. These were not cruel men, they were businessmen who had viewed Midnight Storm as a valuable asset. But the horse, standing before them, breathing heavily from his rescue efforts while still protecting the child he'd saved, was clearly much more than property. "That's not the same horse we lost 2 years ago," Robert Whitmore said quietly to his father. "Midnight Storm was magnificent, but he was never this. He was never this gentle, this protective of others." Thunder seemed to sense that he was the center of attention, but his focus remained on Emma Fletcher and her mother. The stallion's body language radiated calm protectiveness, a stark contrast to the fear and aggression that had defined him at the auction. Jake stood slowly, one hand resting on Thunder's neck, and faced the crowd that had formed around them. In their faces, he saw the same recognition that was filling his own heart. They had all just witnessed something profound, something that changed the nature of every argument that had been made in the courthouse. "This is who Thunder really is," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Not the broken horse that was sold at auction, not the stolen champion from Colorado. This is who he chose to become when someone finally gave him a chance to heal." Judge Patterson nodded slowly, his legal mind processing the implications of what they had all witnessed. The question of ownership remained, but it had been overshadowed by a more fundamental question: what was truly in Thunder's best interest? Wellington made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. "Your Honor, we can't let sentiment override legal precedent. If we start making decisions based on emotional appeals rather than property law, where does it end?" But even as Wellington spoke, his words rang hollow in the face of what everyone had just seen. Thunder stood in the dusty street like a testament to the power of redemption, proof that some transformations were so complete they created entirely new realities. The child's dropped doll was now safely in Emma Fletcher's arms, but its brief moment in the dust had catalyzed events that would reshape multiple lives. In saving one small girl, Thunder had revealed the true measure of his character and given Jake the most powerful argument possible for their continued partnership. The new ranch sign creaked gently in the desert breeze, its freshly painted letters gleaming in the morning sunlight. Thornton, Thunder Horse, training healing through partnership. Jake stood beside the wooden post he'd driven into the hard-packed earth of his own property, watching Thunder graze peacefully in the pasture that stretched toward the distant mountains. 5 years had passed since that day in court, when everything changed. Judge Patterson's ruling had been as wise as it was unprecedented. Thunder would remain with Jake, but Charles Whitmore would receive financial compensation for his loss, funded by the recovery of assets from Bartholomew Wellington's criminal enterprise. Wellington himself was serving a 10-year sentence in the territorial prison, his network of horse theft and abuse finally brought to justice through the evidence that Morrison and Sheriff Coleman had painstakingly assembled. The legal resolution had been only the beginning of their story. Word of Thunder's transformation and Jake's methods had spread throughout the territory, bringing a steady stream of visitors to the small ranch Jake had purchased with his share of the reward money. Horse owners from 3 states sought his help with animals that others had written off as hopeless horses traumatized by abuse, spooked by accidents, or simply misunderstood by handlers who relied on force rather than patience. Sarah emerged from the modest house they'd built together, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the contented smile that had become Jake's favorite sight in the world. They'd married 2 years earlier in a ceremony attended by half of Millbrook, with Thunder serving as an honorary witness who had remained perfectly still throughout the vows. "How's our newest student doing?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the small corral where a bay mare named Rosie worked through her fear of human contact. The mare had arrived 3 weeks earlier, another victim of brutal training methods. But already she was showing signs of the trust that would eventually heal her wounded spirit. "She let me touch her neck yesterday," Jake replied with satisfaction. "Give her another month, and she'll be ready to go home to people who actually deserve her." Their method was simple but revolutionary in its effectiveness. Instead of breaking horses through dominance and force, Jake taught owners to earn their horses' partnership through patience, consistency, and respect. The Indian bridle had become his signature tool, but the real secret was the understanding he'd gained from Thunder, that every horse was an individual with his own history, fears, and capacity for trust. Thunder himself had become something of a legend throughout the territory. Now, in his prime at 12 years old, he remained Jake's constant companion and co-teacher in their work with troubled horses. His gentle nature and obvious happiness served as living proof that even the most damaged animals could heal when given proper care. Doc Harrison visited regularly, officially to check on the horses, but really to marvel at the transformation of both Jake and Thunder. The old veterinarian was in his 70s now, but his eyes still sparkled with wonder when he watched Thunder work with a frightened young horse, teaching through example what humans often fail to communicate through words. "You know," Doc said one afternoon as they watched Thunder patiently encourage a skittish colt to approach the water trough, "I've been thinking about that day at the auction. Wellington thought he was destroying you both by forcing you together. Instead, he created something beautiful." Jake nodded, his hand resting on the fence rail that Thunder had helped him build. "Funny how life works sometimes. The worst thing that ever happened to us turned out to be the best thing, too." The ranch had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for people throughout the region. Families brought their children to meet the famous gentle giant who had saved little Emma Fletcher. Horse enthusiasts traveled hundreds of miles to observe Jake's training methods. Even other horse trainers, initially skeptical of techniques that seemed too gentle to be effective, left convinced that partnership produced better results than domination. Charles and Robert Whitmore had visited the previous year, making the long journey from Colorado to see what had become of their former champion. The meeting had been emotional for everyone involved, particularly when Thunder showed no signs of recognizing his former owners. He was polite but distant with the Whitmores, while obviously devoted to Jake and Sarah. "He's not the same horse we lost," Charles Whitmore had admitted, watching Thunder perform a complex series of movements in response to Jake's subtle signals. "He's become something better, not just a champion, but a teacher. I think he's exactly where he belongs." The Whitmores had left behind a substantial donation to help fund Jake's work with abused horses, a gesture that had moved Jake to tears and confirmed his belief that most people, given the chance to see beyond their initial assumptions, chose compassion over mere ownership. Emma Fletcher, now 8 years old and a regular visitor to the ranch, had developed a special relationship with Thunder that reminded everyone of that dramatic day when he'd saved her life. The horse seemed to remember their first meeting, always greeting her with particular gentleness and allowing her liberties he granted no other child. "Mr. Jake," Emma said during one of her visits, her small hand stroking Thunder's neck while he stood patient as a statue, "why do you think Thunder saved me that day? I was just a stranger to him." Jake considered the question carefully, remembering his father's words about character being measured by how you treat what's been given to your care. "I think Thunder understood something that took me longer to learn, Emma. We're all connected in ways that go deeper than just knowing each other's names. When you see someone in trouble, and you have the power to help, that's when you find out who you really are. Thunder's legacy extended far beyond his own transformation. His offspring he'd sired a dozen foals, with carefully selected mares inherited not just his physical magnificence, but also his gentle temperament and intelligence. Young horses trained using Jake's methods were in demand throughout the territory, known for their reliability, responsiveness, and calm dispositions. But perhaps Thunder's greatest gift was the example he provided of redemption and second chances. His story had become part of local folklore, told and retold around campfires and in saloons, inspiring people facing their own struggles to believe that even the most broken situations could be healed with patience and love. As evening approached and the desert sky painted itself in shades of gold and crimson, Jake walked through the pasture toward Thunder, who lifted his magnificent head from his grazing and nickered a greeting. The stallion's coat gleamed with health, his scars now badges of honor rather than marks of shame, his eyes bright with contentment. "Ready to head in, old friend?" Jake asked, running his hand along Thunder's powerful neck. Thunder's response was to step closer and rest his head on Jake's shoulder, a gesture that never failed to fill Jake with gratitude for the day a cruel man's joke had brought them together. They walked toward the barn as they had done thousands of times before, man and horse united in partnership that had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others who had learned from their example. The new ranch sign continued its gentle creaking in the evening breeze, advertising a simple truth that had taken Jake a lifetime to understand. The strongest bonds are forged, not through force or ownership, but through mutual respect, patience, and the recognition that every living being deserves the chance to become their best self. In the distance, a young horse whinnied its goodnight to the darkening sky, and Thunder answered with a sound that spoke of peace, contentment, and the deep satisfaction that comes from finding your true home at last.